An experienced outdoorsman set out to summit Mount Shasta with two of his friends. He became very ill with altitude sickness, and the trip went sideways. He was last seen heading towards Lake Helen and was never seen again. His disappearance mirrors another man who went missing while hiking Shasta in 1965, despite this man having successfully summited over 40 times. Welcome to Morbid Outdoors, the podcast that ventures deep into the shadows of the wild. Here, we unravel the mysteries of missing persons, explore spine-chilling legends, and share the most morbid stories that nature has to offer. From the depths of the dense forests to the highest mountain peaks, we'll uncover the secrets that lie hidden in the great outdoors. Join us as we navigate the eerie, the unexplained, and the terrifying. So if you dare, grab your gear and let's embark on a journey into the unknown. This is Morbid Outdoors. Hi everyone, happy Wednesday. I hope you guys are all having a great week and enjoying the warmer weather. Right now, at the time of this recording, I went on a beautiful hike yesterday in Immigration Canyon, just right outside of Salt Lake City. It was great, but unfortunately, I got very sunburnt. I applied sunscreen to my face before the hike and during the hike, but I didn't take into consideration that I was hiking in the midday, and I am about as red as a lobster. So first sunburn of the year, hopefully it's the only one, and next time I will remember to hike earlier in the day and wear sunscreen. So today's case, we're going to be going to the Shasta-Trinity National Forest. I've heard Shasta, I've heard Shasta. When I lived near this area, I heard Shasta more often. So that is how I will be pronouncing it. Now, like I said, I used to live in Southern Oregon, not too far away from the Shasta area. And I've done a little bit of hiking in this area, and it is so beautiful. And so I'm going to start out with negative reviews about the National Forest. Now, I want to note the time frame that this review is posted. It was 11 years ago, and it says, "Nature is closed unless you're on foot or horseback, so only strong, healthy people need apply. Losers like you and me who need motorized transport to see a nature are now banned." Not sure what that review is about, but I found it very interesting. Someone sounds very salty. The next negative review says, "I am an atheist. I must have driven past that place. I recommend driving past all churches and anyone else trying to sell you invisible products." I think this person was confused, but still, these reviews were just too weird to pass up. The next review says, "Got abducted by Bigfoot. David Politis rescued me though. Forest Service won't release the names of my friends that are still missing. 1 star. The last review says, "Just very bad." So interesting reviews about the National Forest. The specific trail we're going to be talking about today is Mt.Shasta via Avalanche Gulch route. And this is a review from that trail. "We took the wrong trail, poorly marked, and ended up on a ridge hike to the top. Above the tree line, the rock is unstable, and it's mountaineering, not a hike as I'd promised my hiking buddy. Very tough. I'm in marathon shape, but this was a very difficult, unstable mountain. Granted, the scenery was so beautiful, and my partner and I had a great attitude." So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's probably a very realistic review of this trail from someone that says they're in very good shape, but that this was still a very challenging climb. And I liked how they mentioned it's not a hike, it's mountaineering. And if you're not familiar with the outdoors or the definitions of hiking versus mountaineering. Let me just say, mountaineering is like way more technical than hiking. It involves so much more planning and safety, precautions than hiking does. And so, really, fewer people mountaineer than hike, just generally speaking. So, let's get into background about this national forest. The Shasta-Trinity National Forest is a federally designated forest in Northern California. It is the largest national forest in California and is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. It sits at over 2.2 million acres and has 5 wilderness areas, hundreds of mountain lakes, and over 6,200 miles of streams and rivers. Major features include Shasta Lake, which is the largest man-made lake in California, and, of course, Mt.Shasta, whose elevation is 14,179 feet. This national forest offers a wide range of recreational activities. These include hiking, backpacking, mountain climbing, horseback riding, camping, boating, fishing, hunting, sightseeing, downhill skiing and riding, snowboarding, cross-country skiing, and snowmobiling. The 5 wildernesses that are in this national forest are Castle Crags Wilderness, Chanchelula Wilderness, Mount Shasta Wilderness, Trinity Alps Wilderness, and Yala Bali Middle Eel Wilderness. What a strange name. Also, something that's a little bit different about this national forest, it does contain a national wild and scenic river, and that happens to be the main branch of the Trinity River, and it runs through this national forest. Shasta Lake has 365 miles of shoreline made up of many arms and inlets. So if you've ever driven in this area, you've seen Shasta Lake. It's so beautiful. And actually, years ago, it was so low. I think the water level is better now, but it looked just like a puddle before I moved to Oregon. It was really sad to see, but I think now the water level is doing a lot better. The Shasta-Trinity National Forest has over 460 miles of trails, including a 154-mile section of the Pacific Crest Trail in an east to west direction. The 500-mile Volcanic Legacy Scenic Byway is an auto tour of Northern California's volcanoes, and it actually starts at Lassen Volcanic National Park, then goes to Mount Shasta, and ends at Crater Lake National Park. I have driven this road many times, and it is an absolutely stunning scenic drive. It is so pretty. You see so much variation in the land and the landscape and the trees, and it is just so pretty. I have driven it in the winter, and it was kind of scary because it was just packed snow. You couldn't see the road. Still beautiful, but a little scarier in the winter than in the summer. And if you didn't know, Mount Shasta is actually a volcano. On average, Mount Shasta has erupted at least once every 800 years during the last 10,000 years, and about once every 600 years in the previous 4,500 years. Scientists believe there is a good chance that Shasta could erupt again, just like Mount St. Helens, within the next 30 years. The USGS expects a 3.5% chance. So kind of a scary fact, but very interesting. So I don't know, in the next 30 years, it's like Mount Shasta could do the exact same thing that happened with Mount Helens in the 80s. So like I said earlier, the trail that the trio was hiking, or I should say mountaineering, was Mount Shasta via Avalanche Gulch route. And this is from All Trails. It says, proceed cautiously on this 10.1 mile out and back trail near Mount Shasta, California. Generally considered a highly challenging route, it should only be attempted by experienced adventurers. This is a very popular area for backpacking, hiking, and skiing, so you'll likely encounter other people while exploring. The best times to visit the trail are April through July. It goes on to say it's an epic ascent of a 14,000-foot California volcano. It's pretty much the standard route up from the Bunny Flats area with overnight campsites at Lake Helen or like near and around that lake. From there, the trail goes through Red Banks to Misery Hill, ending at the true summit. So it's a very long trail and a very technical one at that. It's been described as having a 7,000 vertical foot ascent that exposes climbers to steep snow and ice, rockfall, and weather extremes. Timing when doing this route is especially important. Early in the season, the route is completely covered in snow and ice. And online, it said the best time to visit this route was when the lower portions lose their snow cover and the route is a mix of good trail to like tough, so good to tough, with loose scree and sandy surfaces. It says doing this later in the season is not advised as you'll be exposed to rockfall. Winter ascents are technical and dangerous and have an increased avalanche hazard, extreme weather, and shorter days. Now, like I said, mountaineering and hiking are very different, and technical gear and skills are required to do this route. Basically, if you don't have appropriate mountaineering experience, you don't need to do this, or you need to go with an experienced guide. If I'm being totally clear, this route is not for the general public. I would never attempt this hike. I'm in no shape to do that. I have very little mountaineering experience, and it would not be a safe route for me to do. So this is just a reminder to everyone that just because a trail is online or on all trails does not mean that it's accessible for you to do. But the hikers we're going to talk about today, they did attempt it and they were prepared for it, but something still went wrong. So this is one of those rare cases where someone was carrying the 10 essentials plus more, and he still got lost and is still missing. This is a pretty popular case in the outdoors true crime community, so I'm sure you've heard of it. But we're going to be discussing the case of Carl Landers. Now, Carl was 69 years old, and he lived in Orinda, California. He had recently retired from a career in the air conditioning industry, and he was married to a woman named Bobby, who actually happens to be the former mayor of Orinda, and they had 3 children. Colleagues at work and friends described him as an experienced climber, hiker, and distance runner in very good shape. Apparently, for 30 years, he had run every morning and even completed in the Boston Marathon, and his time was 5 hours and 30 minutes. In his later years, he was ambitious to climb the highest peaks in every county in California, a story that was even covered on local media. So he is like very, very in shape, very athletic, has a lot of experience, and works out every single day. And like I said, this was like when news stories do little like stories on things happening. Carl was one of those stories. He was going to hike the highest peak in every county in California. And this was kind of a big deal. It's not like you get an award or anything like that, but it's something that he wanted to do to kind of make his mark on something, something that he enjoyed, but something that was just a cool thing to do and a hard thing to do. And he was doing it. In May 1998, a year before he disappeared, Carl had actually climbed Mt.Shasta, but didn't manage to reach the summit, and he vowed to return to reach the peak the second time around. Come what may, he was really determined to reach the summit in 1999, and that's kind of where our story begins today. So in May 1999, Carl set out again, this time to conquer the summit of Mt.Shasta. Accompanying him were his 2 close friends, Milton Gaines, who was 64, and Barry Gilmore, who was 60. both fellow members of the Arenda Roadrunners, a local running club where they had all met. So you've got 3 very athletic, middle-aged men, actually probably older than middle-aged, if we're being honest. And they were going out to Mount Shasta. I'm not sure if Milton and Barry had ever done Mount Shasta before, but I don't know. They might have, they might not have. I could not find anything in any of the sources online that says, yes, they'd done it, or no, they hadn't. But Carl had. He just never reached the real summit. And it's unknown why he wasn't able to reach the summit the first time. The trio had planned to start their hike on Friday, May 21st, 1999, and return by the evening of the following day. Now, for this hike, that's kind of a lofty goal in my opinion. Carl hoped to climb Mount Eddy and another mountain, while Milt and Barry would return home after the Shasta summit attempt. Carl's wife, Bobby, wanted to talk Carl out of doing these 2 extra hikes because she never liked it when he climbed alone. It's really, not safe. We've talked about this. It can be safe, but overall it's better to be in groups. Before leaving on the trip, Carl told his wife that he wasn't happy with the jacket he planned to use. So Bobby suggested that he take her bright purple jacket instead, which he reluctantly agreed to do. And maybe he reluctantly agreed to do that because it was purple, or maybe because it was a woman's jacket. I have no idea. But if he was complaining about his, I'm not sure why it was a big deal for him to wear hers. Carl's, Gaines, and Gilmore's routes started at the Bunny Flat Trailhead, which is at 6,860 feet. Most climbers backpack up to Lake Helen or 50-50 Camp, which is the name of it, and those are about 10,443 feet. They usually do this in a day. They sleep, and then they summit the next day and then walk back down. With a pack, it should take 3 to 4 hours to get to Lake Helen, and that is only 3.5 miles from Bunny Flats. So hard climb, really challenging, and a lot of elevation gain. Then from Lake Helen, it's about 3 to 6 hours to the summit, and about 2 to 3 hours hike back to Lake Helen, and then 2 hours down to the trailhead. I am not a mountaineer, and so I say this just being a, day hiker, backpacker. May 21st is kind of early to be doing this mountain climb. I live in Salt Lake City. I did a hike last year at around the same time, and there was still so much snow. It made the climb and the hike way harder, and it even had way less elevation gain. So I can't imagine the amount of snow that was still up there at 12, 13, 14,000 feet. But in terms of supplies, this group had all the right stuff. They were equipped with ice axes, crampons, and climbing clothing, as even in May, the upper parts of Shasta are covered in deep, deep snowdrifts. Basically, conditions on this mountain are always dangerous, as the mountain is steep in parts and rocks can be very slippery. Carl was wearing 2 or 3 layers of clothing, which included ski pants and hiking boots, with the possibility of attaching crampons. So Carl, Barry, and Milt set out that Friday morning at around 6:30 a.m. from their homes in a shared car. They arrived in the town of Mt.Shasta at 11 a.m. They then headed to the trailhead at Bunny Flat parking area and set out on the Avalanche Gulch route towards Horse Camp as planned at 3 p.m., taking a camera to record their adventure. Carl was initially feeling well as they started hiking the steep, stony track towards Horse Camp. Still, before long, he started suffering from diarrhea, either due to the altitude or from Diamox tablets that he was taking to try and avoid altitude sickness, which he was sometimes prone to suffering. As a result, Carl had to stop several times on the route to relieve himself, losing precious fluid from his body. Now, if you know anything about elevation, hypothermia, altitude sickness, you need to be hydrated all the time. It helps with a lot of the symptoms. It is very important to drink a lot of water and to stay hydrated while you're hiking, especially in high elevations. Hypothermia and dehydration are not good combinations on a mountain climb and can often lead to really, really bad trouble. So if you think about it, they started hiking late, what I would consider late, and they had to wait on Carl several times because he was sick. He was not feeling very well. And can you imagine having really bad diarrhea in the backcountry with no flushing toilet and digging a cat hole? You were supposed to dig a hole if you need to go number 2, but I don't know if he even had time to do that. If you've ever had diarrhea before, you know that there's very little time to prepare for that. So yeah, I think that this trip started off and it started really, really poorly. Although Carl had always been kind of a slow walker, Milton Berry said that on this trip, he seemed slower than usual, maybe because he wasn't feeling very well. And as a result, they offered to carry his 15-pound pack, but Carl, being a stubborn guy, he refused, and he tended to be very stubborn about this. He didn't want to get assistance. He didn't want help. And so Milt and Barry tried walking behind him to prevent him from getting too far behind, but he eventually asked them to pass and lead the way so that they wouldn't get slowed down. So at this point, they're probably thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to take forever to get to camp. We started late. It's not a good idea to be setting up camp in the dark, right? And just to let you know, something that I learned while working with the Boy Scouts and for the Boy Scouts of America at Philmont Scout Ranch is it's usually the best practice to let the slowest hiker go first. That way, everyone stays at a pace that everyone can go and no one gets left behind. This is for safety reasons, but it's actually a really smart thing to do. So the fact that they were walking behind him was the right thing to do, and they probably still should have kept at that pace that Carl could go. But instead, he said, I'm good, you guys go ahead. And so they passed him and they made it up there. They eventually made it to horse camp, but decided to continue to the area on the mountain called 50-50, despite Carl being sick and very slow walking pace. So they just kept going. Milt and Barry arrived at 50-50 camp at around 8 p.m. and began to set up camp for the night. At that time, conditions began to deteriorate, and they actually faced 40 to 50 mile per hour gusts of wind. Wind and camping is not enjoyable. Wind and backpacking, not enjoyable. And yeah, this is kind of how their trip was going. It seemed like everything that was going wrong was. And I'm sure that these people, these men, were not really happy about how their trip was going so far. But since they only planned to do an overnighter, I think they probably were like, okay, this sucks. We can do it. It's just one night. We're going to summit tomorrow and walk back down. And it'll be like a quick misery, right? 50-50 was a popular spot where most climbers would recuperate and wait for the right light and weather conditions before pushing to the summit. This area is covered in boulders and surrounded by steep rock bluffs. It's very, very rugged. Now, after they had set up camp, another hiker arrived at the men's camp and asked if they knew a man who needed help further down the mountain. So Carl still has not made his way up to 50-50. So Milt and Barry made their way down a few hundred yards, and they successfully located Carl, who was finding it harder and harder to keep continuing this trail. They took his pack, they ignored his protests, and all three of them headed back to their makeshift camp at 50-50. Upon arriving, Milt and Barry spent about an hour digging a shelter out of snow and placing the tent in it to give them some protection from the wind. So There's a lot of snow. It's really rugged. It's very windy. And you've got someone in your party who is very ill. I don't know. I think maybe you turn around and you go home. Maybe not right then, but maybe next thing in the morning. There are some times when things go wrong, and I feel like things go wrong for a reason so that bad things don't happen later. And that might just be me. I'm a little superstitious. But I know that in the past, when I've had things with the outdoors, backpacking, camping, hiking, and things weren't going how I wanted them to go, I kind of just gave up, turned around, and said, I can do this again later when things are better and when things feel right. But they didn't do that. And they actually were like ready to go. Carl was still sick, but they still wanted to finish this trip. Carl was still not feeling well, and he struggled to eat the chicken soup that had been prepared for dinner. His diarrhea continued through the night, and he was not drinking enough water, so he was really risking serious dehydration. Of course, if you feel sick and you're having altitude sickness, you really don't want to drink water. And when I've gotten it in the past, I've had to just lay in bed and nurse a Pedialyte. And there are other things you can also drink as well. But like when you're feeling altitude sickness, oof, it is not fun. And so Carl was not drinking enough water. So he's losing all this water and he's not replacing it. And dehydration is a killer when you're in the backcountry. So the group had planned to sleep and head up the mountain at around 3 a.m., but given their late arrival at 50:50 and the time to set up camp, they woke up late around 6 a.m. So again, we're on day 2. They're starting too late. Things are not going well. They made some hot chocolate, which was difficult as the stove struggled to light in the strong winds. Like I said, everything that could go wrong was going wrong. Milt and Barry said that Carl was unusually quiet during this time, but he did manage to drink some of the hot chocolate and was able to eat about half a bagel with cream cheese. Still not enough fluids or food to sustain the amount of energy that you're going to be expelling to do this hike. Because Carl was unusually quiet, Milt and Barry did ask him if he was feeling okay. Carl said he was fine and wanted to keep climbing the mountain. He was adamant, as he said it was unlikely he'd have another chance to get up there. Carl still had diarrhea during this time, having to take 2 toilet breaks before they even set off that morning. And they set off on the dangerous hike. The wind speed was increasing and there were very steep slopes in this area. They decided to head up to Lake Helen, which was a relatively short hike, and decide whether they would continue the trip or just abandon it and head back to their car. Milt and Barry suggested to Carl that since he was moving slowly and not feeling well, he should go ahead while they took down the tent, and that they would just catch up with him once they had packed all of their stuff. So they were saying, Carl, since you're a little slower, you get a head start and we'll see you up there. Since Lake Helen was so close, they thought that they would be able to see Carl climbing towards it, so that they were not concerned that he would be leaving before them. Many other hikers were in the area to intervene if Carl got into trouble. So it's not like just these 3 men out there. There are a lot of other people. They think it's a short hike, he'll get there, and if anything happens, there are a lot of other people to help and aid in anything that happens. They got a late start at 9 a.m. Carl left the camp and started up the mountain, and this is when he disappeared. He is never seen again. So 45 minutes later, at around 9:45, Barry starts walking towards Lake Helen, with Milt around 15 minutes behind because he was having some issues with his crampons on his boots. Eventually, Milt caught up with Barry around halfway to Lake Helen, and Barry appeared pale. He said he felt unwell and that the altitude was getting to him. He decided he would turn back towards the trailhead at this point, further down the mountain, and get back to their vehicle at Bunny Flat. Milt continued to head towards Lake Helen to try and catch up with Carl so that he could tell Carl that, hey, we're just going to call it, let's head back down the mountain. But when he got there, Carl was nowhere to be found. Milt asked other climbers whether they'd seen someone looking like Carl with a purple jacket, but none of the other hikers had seen him. He then found a park ranger, and he told Milt that he had seen a man matching this description who had asked him to show the different routes up the mountain, and he had advised him not to take the more difficult, steeper route. So Milt is panicking, can't find Carl, and they need to call this trip off. Milt looked up both trails and saw several people hiking up the easier trail and a single male walking up the harder one. Milt wasn't sure, but he thought it could be Carl, since the person was walking 5 steps forward, stopping to rest, continuing, and so on, just like Carl had been doing the day before. So Milt thinks this hiker could be Carl. He tried to catch up with this person, but couldn't catch him. When he eventually got to the rim, he couldn't locate this man, but looking at the footprints, it looked like this guy had joined a larger group to continue to the summit. Milt decided that Carl could not have gotten this far this fast, and so he decided to head back down the mountain to look for him. When Milt finally returned to 50-50, which is where they had their camp set up, he met other climbers who collectively decided to contact the sheriff's department and report Carl missing. Interesting that he had to speak with other people to realize, oh crap, I need to get law enforcement involved. So he headed back to Bunny Flat, but before departing 50-50, he left behind his tent, a sleeping bag, and food in case Carl made it back there. So Carl did not have his stuff. Any experienced hiker knows that splitting up a group is not a good idea, and at this point, all 3 climbers were separated from one another. On May 22nd at around 8 p.m., the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department received a call about a missing hiker at Mt.Shasta. Presumably, this was Milt placing the call from his cell phone. He requested that the sheriff meet Barry Gilmore, who is now down in the Bunny Flat parking lot area. Barry was met 15 minutes later, and he gave the details to assist the search and rescue effort. They didn't start immediately searching that night. If you guys know, these are volunteers that put their lives on the line to look for missing people. So the search started the next morning, May 23rd, after Carl was reported missing the previous night at 8 p.m. They used the National Guard Air Ambulance helicopter and the California Highway Patrol helicopter equipped with an infrared sensing device called FLIR or FLIR. U.S. Forest Rangers and Shasta Mountain Guides conducted a ground search on skis, horses, and foot. They were joined by volunteers from Marin and San Mateo counties, along with others from Southern Oregon, Sutter, Placer, and Humboldt counties. So this was a huge, huge effort to try and find Carl because they knew he didn't have any gear or supplies, and they knew that he was sick, so time was of the essence. Several members of the Orenda Roadrunners, as well as family and friends, also joined the search. The Mt.Shasta City schoolyard was initially used as the base camp for the search, but as the number of searchers grew, the location was switched to the Weed Airport. And yes, Weed, California, that is a place. It's in the shadows of Mount Shasta east of Interstate 5 near the Weed Rest area. And that was always where we'd stop for McDonald's on our road trips, was the Weed McDonald in Weed, California. So in part of this search, the helicopter pilot took professional climbers to the summit, dropped them off, and they descended the mountain in a downwards route. They used separate routes at different points, and so that they could cover the most ground faster, right? But despite this extensive search, they found no sign of Carl on the mountain at all. Like, his body wasn't there, there was no clothing, backpack, or other equipment. There were no footprints in the snow and nothing to suggest that he was ever in the area of Mount Shasta. When Carl's wife was informed that he was missing, she said she had a strange feeling when Carl left for the trip that something was wrong and that he was in trouble. I could go on and on about this, but all I'm going to say, and I've said it before and I will say it again, your body, your gut knows things are wrong before your brain does. It is an evolutionary thing that we still get these gut feelings, and they're important and you should listen to them. I know it sounds woo-woo, but there's science behind it. Our brain and our gut are connected, and oftentimes our gut knows things before our brain processes them. So it sounds like his wife was having one of those gut feelings. 3 days later, on May 26th, the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department sent 2 deputies to the Search and Rescue Command Post at the Weed Airport to meet with Sergeant Nicholson, who was overseeing operations. They intended to determine if there was any evidence of foul play. Of course, they have to consider this because when there's no evidence that this man was ever on Mount Shasta, they are starting to maybe suspect maybe he wasn't really there. Unfortunately, Nicholson got key details of the disappearance incorrect. For example, he reported that the men had stayed at the Sierra Club cabin at Horse Camp, not 50-50, on May 21st and then in the morning. So basically, they had the location wrong. A location completely different to the actual point. Nicholson told deputies that search and rescue focused on the wooded area below where Carl was last seen, which was completely incorrect. All the evidence that was that Carl was heading up from 50-50, not down towards Bunny Flat. Sergeant Nicholson also reported that he did talk to the Forest Service employee who thought he remembered talking to Carl at the Lake Helen area, but was not positive that it was him the employee even spoke to. Interviews were held on May 28th to help positively rule out any possibility of foul play. Of course, they interviewed Carl's wife, Bobby Landertz, at the Weed Rest area. They informed her that the authorities had no reason to believe that Milt, Barry, or a third party were responsible for foul play. The next day, on May 29th, detectives met with Barry Gilmore and Milt Gaines, and they said they were unaware that Carl had any financial problems or personal issues. They said everyone liked Carl because he was stubborn, could become argumentative, and occasionally lost control for a short time. But they said that he was a nice guy. This was always verbal, and he wasn't physically violent or aggressive with anyone. So at this point in the search, the sheriff obviously suspects that Carl disappeared on purpose. And I know that this was frustrating to the friends and family because they know in their deepest, in their heart of hearts, that Carl had no reason to disappear like this. Milt Gaines said initially that he was actually hesitant and didn't want to call the sheriff to get a search started because in 1997, Carl was hiking with others in Monterey County, and, he was a slow walker. He started lagging behind. He told the group members that he would meet them at the summit or on the way down, but they grew concerned when the others arrived at their cars and didn't see Carl. Search and rescue was called in at this time, and the team arrived in the area, but just as they were preparing to start the operation to search for and rescue Carl, he suddenly appeared out of the woods, totally fine, apart from being a bit hot and dehydrated. So, given this incident, Milt was like, I don't know if I should call search and rescue so soon, because he didn't want to call and then search and rescue start, and then Carl was totally fine. This was a factor in not letting anyone know they needed help earlier. In terms of foul play, Milt and Barry both said that they didn't think anyone would do anything to Carl. They said that the area was so wide open and there were so many people on the mountain that someone would have seen something suspicious, like Carl being attacked. Milt would later say that whatever happened to Carl was beyond his understanding. Detectives noted that both Barry and Milt seemed very concerned and upset about their friend during the interview, and that they actually felt responsible for Carl going missing, and it was really eating away at them. So it's been a week, and a little more than a week after Carl vanished, members of the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department were briefing journalists that there was still a high probability that Carl would be found alive. He had some food in his pack, and the snow would give him access to drinking water. So while he didn't have all of his supplies, he did have some food. The official search for Carl Landers was called off on June 3rd, 1999. On November 6, 2000, the case was put on inactive status because there were no clues that had ever been found. However, searchers conducted numerous additional search and rescue operations in the Shasta area in the years after, but obviously with no success. Now, the person who was heading the search and rescue was a man named Grizz Adams. He was a veteran of over 400 search and rescue operations and 20 years of experience in searching in this specific area. In an interview with David Paulides, he said, quote, "In 35 years, I've never had this happen to me. We were all over that mountain. He was not on the mountain. We brought canines in. They didn't pick him up. We flew around it. We dropped guys at the summit. They came down all sides. They couldn't find him. They talked to people who were on the mountain. They didn't see him. There's snow around the path where he was, and nobody went outside the path," end quote. When Paulides asked Grizz Adams what he thought happened to Carl Landers on the mountain, Grizz replied, "That's the million-dollar question. He either went up or in, but he's not on it." In all of the many search and rescue operations that Grizz was involved with, only 2, including Carl's, turned up no trace. The second case was Rosemary Kunst at Spirit Lake and close to Mt.Shasta, who disappeared during a short walk with nothing ever found apart from a strand of her hair. County Sheriff spokeswoman Susan Gravenkamp said, quote, "We've looked everywhere that we can look, and we just don't know where else to look. Above the tree line, the mountain is not hugely steep, with no crevices, steep cliffs, and plenty of flat areas. It made no sense that a man like Carl could disappear off the mountain." In the Uncharted Mysteries documentary, Episode 6, The Legend of Mt.Shasta, this was in 2020, Grizz Adams said, "It was extremely open country. See the rock bluffs there? Carl was sick. He's not going to climb those bluffs. After our initial searches, there were no findings. You have to open the search area. A sick man goes downhill, so then you start working downhill, and we never found a thing. Not one trace of where Carl went." Later this month marks 26 years that Carl's been missing, and nothing has ever been found, not even a trace of his equipment, and it was assumed that Carl disappeared somewhere between 50-50 Plateau and Lake Helen, as no tracks were spotted off of that trail. This distance is only 650 feet, a relatively flat area with no dense brush or tree cover. So literally this is like, where did he go? He's not on the mountain. Ugh, it's so creepy. I think that this case likely has supernatural or paranormal, I don't know, like it's just, I want to, when I talk with someone about this case, everyone's like, oh, well, he probably fell in a crevasse or whatever. In this area, none of that was there. Where did he go? There are no crevices, dense vegetation, or trees that would obscure a body or his equipment. The lake and forest at the mountain's base were searched thoroughly, like in a grid system. Even after cadaver and human scent dogs were used, they detected nothing. There's nowhere for Carl to hide, and locals familiar with the mountains were baffled, just like everybody else. It's even weirder that at the time he disappeared, there were 50 to 100 people around Lake Helen, at that time, and not one of them saw Carl. The only evidence he was there at all was his abandoned backpack at 50/50. Milt said there was more than a 50% chance that something strange happened. I think it's 100% chance if we're being honest, but this was said way back when. So let's talk about what could have happened to Carl. First, if he succumbed to hypothermia, he would have left behind boots or clothing, yet nothing has been discovered in all these years. And because it was such a big case and a lot of people knew about it, I feel if those items were found, they would have been turned over to police. And I don't know. It's just like, how do you have that many people? No one sees him and no one finds anything. That is the weirdest part of this case to me personally. Next, if he had become delirious from the medication he was taking, he wouldn't get very far in the area that he was walking because there are all these steep rock bluffs. And let's talk about animals. Although there are black bears, mountain lions, and coyotes, they are only appearing at lower elevations. Once you get past a tree line, there's really just marmots. I mean, if you're being serious, and they are not going to attack a human or do any sort of major physical damage. Sorry, guys, my dog was trying to alert me of something, but let's keep going. The theory that I mostly thought of before I started doing deep dives on this case was foul play. I thought maybe his friends, got rid of him. They established this story. We're going to go on this hike. And I didn't know if Carl had even made it on the mountain. So let's just think. Perhaps his friends were lying and they brought the bag to the campsite and they left it to mislead investigators. But the only thing with that is that you need a permit to summit Mount Shasta, and you have to check in and sign your name. And Carl's signature was found on the logbook. I'm not saying they could have, falsified that, but it did seem like Carl was there. So we get into, did Carl lead a double life and have to vanish for his safety? I don't know. Was he burdened with debt and he wanted to get out and kind of leave all of his problems behind? Maybe. It's possible, but pretty unlikely. Friends and Carl's wife confirmed all was well in his life and he had no reason to disappear. If we're going to talk supernatural, let's talk about what Mount Shasta is known for. It's known that there is an ancient civilization in the mountain, and it's been suggested that that's why so many people go missing from this area, because there are people called Lemurians. Or I guess they're not people, but they are ancient beings. There's lots of lore and legends surrounding Mount Shasta, and while I don't have enough time to explain all of them, a lot of indigenous tribes placed a lot of importance on this mountain, and many stories they tell about Mount Shasta, they have like a wary respect for the area, probably for good reason. I think something's definitely going on there. Carl's case is one of the most puzzling in the outdoors/true crime community because it has no apparent explanation. I even watched a video last year about Carl's disappearance. I was talking with my father-in-law about it, and so he put on a YouTube, and I cannot remember this guy's name, but he actually went out and was gonna retrace the footsteps of Carl, Barry, and Milt, and he actually got sick, vomiting, diarrhea, sick, and it was almost eerie watching this, him recounting. He filmed the area, he filmed himself. He got very ill. He wasn't able to make it all the way up because of how sick he got. And the fastest way to help with altitude sickness is to get down to a lower altitude. So this backpacker got up to 50/50, saw kind of where, the group had been sleeping and camping, saw what the terrain was like, and had to leave because he was pretty ill. So just interesting that, it's definitely possible Carl was really sick if we're going to believe that he was actually on that mountain. And it just this YouTuber just proved like, yeah, this is a really hard climb and it has a lot of dangers, not just the landscape, but also what the effect of the outdoors are on your body at this elevation. Now, this isn't the only mysterious vanishing on Mount Shasta. Carl's story actually kind of echoes a similar one that happened in July of 1965. This is when an 80-year-old John Neza disappeared on July 17th, 1965. Now, John was a seasoned climber who had actually summited Mount Shasta over 40 times, which is crazy, and he set out alone that day, leaving most of his gear at the Sierra Club cabin at Horse Camp. Now, he was expecting a routine climb. He'd done this so many times before. He carried some wine, whiskey, and fried chicken. And let me tell you, that sounds like a really good, fun hike, but, he wasn't really equipped for the climb. I think he got too comfortable. He'd done this so many times, and something bad happened. He was last seen at Lake Helen, and he vanished without a trace. That's insane, just like Carl, but 40-something years before. Despite reports of buzzards circling in the Red Banks area above Lake Helen, no remains or his equipment were ever found. So he literally was very experienced with this mountain, had done it over 40 times, went missing, vanished, still has never been found. And even in all the searching that they did for Carl, they never found anything related to John Neza either. Carl left behind a family who still wonders where he is today. Carl's story is one of infamy in the outdoors community, and there is so much speculation around his disappearance. I want to know what you think happened that day. I personally think either one, foul play was involved, and maybe his friends were up to something. I don't know. But it seems like Carl was never on that mountain. Or did Carl perhaps accidentally pass through a portal in time? I think anything's possible, especially when we can't prove or disprove one theory or the other. Carl was last seen May 25th, 1999. He was 69 years old when he went missing, and today he would be 94 years old. If you know anything about the disappearance of Carl Landers, you're asked to call the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department at 530-842-8300. As always, recreate responsibly, and remember, sometimes the great outdoors aren't always great. Thanks for listening to Morbid Outdoors. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform. It's free, easy, and it helps us out immensely. When you subscribe, you get updates on our latest episodes, and it also boosts our visibility, making it easier for other curious souls to find us. Another great way to support Morbid Outdoors is by leaving us a review. Whether you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, a quick review helps us know what you love about the show. Find us on Instagram and Facebook at Morbid Outdoors Podcast. You can email us case suggestions and your campfire stories at morbidoutdoorspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for the support, and I'll see you next time. Hey everyone, thanks for staying for the after show. I don't have much to talk about this week, but I am so psyched. I am finally going to visit Great Basin National Park in Nevada, and I'm going to hike to the glacier, and I'm very excited. I was going to do it this summer, but I want more of my summer to be spent in Utah, so I will be heading out there in September. And I'm very, very excited. So if you've been to Great Basin National Park, I would love some recommendations on food to eat in the area. And I know there's not a lot. And trails besides the one that I obviously have planned. Like, I think I might want to do a cave tour, but I don't know. Caves aren't like my I don't know. They're not like a huge thing for me. But if it's worth it, let me know. I plan to go kayaking this coming weekend. I'm so excited, and I hope that you guys are all getting outdoors and staying active. And I hope you guys have a great week and weekend. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you guys next time.